There was tension in the room as family members and friends watched Chris Lampin and Jim Jones argue angrily while exchanging suspicious glances, uncertain of how to deal with Jim, who had a notoriously short fuse. While he stood tall and grew steadily, Chrissy shuddered a little, her own feelings a mix of amazement and anger. Chrissy screamed, "You can't just talk to me like that," her voice cracking under the stress of the situation, his eyes brimming with annoyance. Jim's anger was evident in his voice as he snapped, a phony smile playing on his lips. "You have no right to tell me how to handle things," he responded. Jim was hardly able to control his rage, and the tension in the room rose as he approached Chrissy. He slapped her across the face as his eyes narrowed. Everyone was frozen in shock as the piercing scream shook the room. With her palm leaping to her face, Chrissy staggered backward, her eyes welling with tears as she gazed in agony and amazement. Her eyes shouted, "You've gone insane," and she screamed, her voice filled with anger and pain. Jim, as everyone realized what had just happened, the room seemed to shrink even more, and Chrissy's voice trembled with both disbelief and outrage. "Jim's child, who?" Jim turned to his son and said it in a hateful tone. After standing calmly on the sidelines, he finally said, "Stay out of this," his emotions increasing. There was a mixture of disappointment and rage in his powerful voice. "Enough, Dad. You can't treat her like this." Even more, yet there was no change in his son's face. "This isn't right. You can't just slap her and hope that everything works out. I'm not going to stay out of this." The individuals watching were stunned, and the mood was tense. "You're superior to this, Dad." A fight starts. Jim gave a resolute shake of his head. "This isn't how you handle things. You're pushing everyone away with that." "I'm the one in charge here, not you," Jim growled. Jim gave his son a startled look. Misbehavior still stunned by the slap, Chrissy moved in closer and heard him speak more steadily. Encouraged by Jim's son, she declared, "Jim, this is toxic, and I refuse to accept it anymore." The tension in the room seemed to be broken by her comments like a blade. "Maybe you should leave, Dad, if this is how you're going to behave." Jim's son pointed to the door and said, "This isn't the man." I looked up at Jim, and a look of humiliation and wrath colored his face. He yelled, "You think you can kick me out of my own house?" In a voice laden with disbelief, but his child continued, "If this is how you treat your loved ones, then sure I can. If you can't see it, perhaps you should consider it." Everyone in the room held their breath as the atmosphere became electric as Jim tried to process. He vacillated between understanding and anger for a moment, as if his son's remarks were weighing hard on him. Jim slammed the door behind him and rushed out of the room, his voice low and tight, changing the mood. As he walked away, the tension eased a little. Chrissy exchanged a relieved glance with Jim's child. He turned to Chrissy and asked, "Are you okay?" In a worried tone, Chrissy nodded, but her emotions were still fresh. "I just can't believe that. Violated that boundary. The slap and its circumstances are significant." As Jim's son shook his head and said, "We have to stand our ground," they both took deep breaths. This extends beyond a single instance to the things we permit in our lives. The situation hovers over them. They both realized this was more than a fight and Jim was losing control. The gravity of the situation dawned on them as they sat there in the now quiet chamber. "He has always been loved by me," Chrissy whispered. "We need to work this out as a family if he's willing to change. But if not, we need to," Jim's son said, nodding in accord. "I can't let this continue. I won't allow him to treat me or anybody else like that again," she said in a kind yet stern tone. "Protect ourselves." Their conversation remained in the air with a mix of hope and fear as the hours passed and the sun began to set, bathing the room in a warm glow. They knew talking to Jim about his behavior would be difficult but necessary. Chrissy turned to Jim's youngster, her voice tinged with concern. "Do you believe he will come back?" "I don't know," but his son responded in a sensible way. "We need to be ready if he does, as this cannot be ignored any longer. A sincere conversation is required." As the evening continued and as They grew closer and more determined to improve the health of their surroundings as they talked. Although they were aware that the road ahead would be difficult, they were ready to tackle it together. Jim, meantime, sat alone and reflected on what had just transpired, his mind racing as his actions were poisonous and alienated the people he cared about the most, and he knew deep down that his son was right after considering everything that had been stated. Jim returned home later that night to see that a new understanding had taken root and that the mood in the house had shifted. He understood that if he wanted to be a part of Chrissy and his child's lives, things had to change because he couldn't ignore the united front they put up. Chrissy and Jim's child wouldn't allow him to have the agonizing conversation that had been long overdue. The cycle of anger and abuse continues. In the days that followed, Jim realized that he had to choose between taking responsibility for his actions and changing them or risking losing the people he loved. As Jim sat down for an interview, he thought about the mess he had made in his life. For a while, I felt like I had everything figured out, yet he recognized it in a calm yet heartfelt tone. I loved Chrissy, I was successful, and we had a future together, but I made certain decisions that ruined everything. Jim revealed that Chrissy has participated in a number financial errors, including stealing millions of dollars from him. I thought we were a team, but she cheated on me, and he said in a hurt voice that $7 million was gone in an instant. The betrayal had a profound emotional and financial impact on Jim. The gravity of the treachery was evident when Jim related the tale. He described the pain of knowing that someone he had completely trusted might cause him such severe injury. It felt like I was talking to a stranger when I approached her, he remarked, shaking his head in wonder. Would have gently told her all, he said, but she chose to turn against me instead. Jim's face softened as he talked of his recuperation. I'm picking up the pieces now, he continued, but I won't let this define me. It will take time. I'm getting my power back. His remarks eventually touched a chord of strength. This should serve as a lesson to everyone. Always trust your instincts and never ignore the warning signs. He concluded the interview by saying, "You never know what's lurking in the shadows." The atmosphere in the room was imbued with a mixture of grief and resolution. Jim was ready to tackle any challenges he encountered on the way home, despite the fact that the road ahead would be challenging. He was a man who was determined to change his life and start again. Chrissy and Jim's youngster has also learned. They had discovered strength in each other, built a new foundation based on honesty, respect for one another, and a commitment to recovery, and they were ready to stop. They were prepared to embrace change despite the anguish of the past. As a group, the journey,